People often take issue with the crime rate in LaFollette and Campbell County in general these days. And while bad things do happen, and some things can be cleaned up, the area is actually quite calm compared to its very vile and violent history. Horrific murders took place on a fairly regular basis in LaFollette and other parts of Campbell County. These days there are still violent acts and even killings, but they seem to come spaced out over years. From its founding in the 1890s up until 1950 or so, these violent acts happen in LaFollette and surrounding communities every few months, sometimes every few weeks. In this article, we will look back at a very terrible crime committed in LaFollette that is generally forgotten. Even some at the local historical society didn't remember hearing about this one before I mentioned it a few weeks ago. Transport yourself back, if you will, to LaFollette of the 1930s. In this case, August 1933 to be exact. It's the very height of the Great Depression. The formerly booming ironworks in LaFollette has collapsed. The area is so severely affected by the Depression that the federal government forms TVA and the Project Act Norris is starting. The government is attempting to spur employment in East Tennessee both by providing construction jobs and developing a reliable electric grid for the industry. The heat that summer is oppressive. Citizens of LaFollette see August temperatures well over 6 degrees above normal. Many nights that summer see low temperatures in the 80s with highs near 100. In the East LaFollette area, a young family is growing. Floyd Johnson, 27 years old, his wife Pearl, and their 3 children, Louise, age 7, Paul, aged 5, and Lois, age 3, have a modest one-story home with a hand-dug cellar beneath it. Floyd has a filling station beside the home that he operates, and Pearl is a school teacher. Neither of them makes a lot of money, but they are doing much better than many the Depression had affected in the town. That all changed in the very early morning hours of August 31st, 1933. Floyd Johnson and his wife slept in the front room of the home, and his children slept in the room just down the hall towards the back of the home. Also in the back of the home there was a room that had a door that led into the cellar under the house. Johnson said he was awakened in the night by a whooshing noise, and he jumped out of bed and ran to check on it. He said he ran down the hall and flung open a door that led to the back of the home, where he was greeted by an inferno, belching smoke and fire in all of the directions. Johnson then claimed to have jumped out a window, having no place else to go, and that he ran to another entry to the home and tried to get in that way, but to no avail, as the fire was raging out of control, engulfing the whole structure. Neighbors arrived as Johnson had escaped. He ran to call the fire brigade. Firefighters arrived, but they were too late. The home was a complete and total loss, as there were no hydrants in East LaFollette at this time, and the pumper trucks simply didn't hold enough water to extinguish a fully engulfed home. Nowhere to be found were Pearl and the 3 children. After several hours and some gallons of water pumped onto the fire from the pumper trunk to get the small remaining fire out, the area was cooled enough to enter. Fire personnel made the horrific discovery of 4 very charred bodies near the cellar door of the home. It was Pearl and the children. It appeared that they had somehow become trapped on the wrong side of the fire, and that Pearl was attempting to lead the children into the cellar as a final refuge from the heat and the smoke. Chief of Police Pryor Baird said that the fire had started in the back room of the home at approximately 2 a.m., but that why it had started would have to be determined. He vowed to investigate and attempt to find the cause. Floyd Johnson told the officers at the scene that he had no idea how the fire had started, but that he suspected some enemy of mine may have started it. Who Johnson's enemies were, or why he even had them, he did not say. Otherwise, he told officers of being awakened by the sound of the fire and his frantic attempts to get access to any area his wife and his children might have been, before being forced to give up the heat by the blaze. The county physician, a Dr. Carden, along with a Dr. Rogers and Dr. DeLapp, examined the bodies but were unable to determine very little about any cause of death beyond burning. Their report stated the bodies were charred beyond recognition, burned so badly that even the skulls were quite literally burned to a crisp, according to their autopsy report. A week after interviewing many neighbors regarding what they had seen and heard of the night of the fire, Chief Baird was ready to make an arrest in the case. He called Campbell County Sheriff Dick Bowman to make the arrest and to deliver the man to Knoxville for questioning. It was felt that there were may have been violence against the arrested party had he been questioned in Jacksboro. The man arrested was none other than Floyd Johnson himself. Chief Baird said Johnson's statement about enemies starting the fire had aroused his suspicions. Also suspicious was Johnson's claim that he and his wife were in bed together when he went to sleep, but he didn't know she got up at any point and left the room. The neighbors also said no one heard any kind of screaming coming from the fire at any point. Johnson wasn't calling for his wife or children, nor were they screaming at any point. They all started that they'd merely heard the noise at the fire and came out to see what was happening. Chief Baird traveled to Knoxville, where he reportedly grilled Johnson for over 3 hours. However, Johnson refused to waver from his story that he woke when he heard the fire and spent the next several minutes trying to get back into his home after jumping out the window, then running to call the fire department when he could no longer attempt to enter the home. District Attorney General Jesse L. Rogers stated to the media that no general statement regarding what evidence had been gathered would be released to the public, but then stated that they learned that Johnson mistreated his wife. Had Johnson actually committed this terrible crime? Had he murdered his wife and children in a most heinous fashion? Did he really have enemies that were so against him that they'd kill his entire family? All that was left to the trial, which was set for October 1933. The trial, for its grand scope, called the greatest trial in Campbell County history by the media of the day, only lasted a period of 5 days total. 50 men reported for jury duty on Saturday and Sunday, October 14th and 15th. The trial began Monday the 16th and continued into Tuesday the 17th, when the jury returned a verdict. The trial itself saw over 50 witnesses take the stand, most of them neighbors and people acquainted with Floyd Johnson. Each testified to actions they witnessed from Johnson that night, how he treated his wife, and during the course of the trial it was revealed that Johnson had been unfaithful to his wife with multiple women who were deemed disrespectful. Witnesses even stated they'd heard Johnson talk of getting rid of his wife, Pearl. The prosecution, however, saved their bombshell witness for last. Lawless Anderson was called by the media at the time a surprise witness. Anderson provided damning testimony to Johnson's case. Anderson said on the night of the fire that he was at Johnson's home. Johnson, he said, asked him what it would take to get him, Anderson, to burn my home. Anderson stated that he told Johnson he wouldn't do it for $1,000. Anderson further stated that he left the home around 11:30 p.m. and when he walked about 100 yards away from the Johnson residence, he heard a scream from the house. Anderson said he came forward to the prosecution about testifying because he feared he might be implicated in the murders if he hadn't came forward. Try as they might, and under cross-examination, the defense attorney could not get Anderson to waver or show any inconsistency in his story. As he exited the stand, Anderson was said to shout, "What I've told you is true, and you know it, Floyd Johnson." Johnson took the stand in his own defense. He told the same story he'd given at the scene of the fire and under the intense questioning in Knoxville. That he was awakened by an explosion, opened the door to go down the hall into the back of the house, and was overwhelmed by heat and noxious fumes that made it impossible to breathe. That he jumped out the window and tried to re-enter the home and rescue his wife and children, but that was impossible. He vehemently denied asking Lawless Anderson to burn his home and denied that Anderson even came to his home. He said he was asleep by 11:30 that night and he didn't hear any kind of scream at that hour. The prosecution requested that Johnson be found guilty and if so, be put to death in the electric chair. The defense, as could be expected, said Johnson was not guilty and there were no physical evidence tying him to any kind of crime. That there certainly couldn't be enough proof to send this man to the electric chair. The jury deliberated Tuesday evening and into Wednesday. They determined that Johnson was indeed guilty of the 4 murders. He, however, did not get the death penalty as requested by the prosecution. Johnson was sentenced to 21 years in prison by Judge Conrad F. Troutman for the deaths of his wife and children. Johnson's attorneys vowed to appeal the verdict, citing the prosecution's inclusion of the surprise witness. Other famous murders in town were often repeated even in my childhood by elders who'd been alive during their time. That Hatchet House murder, for instance, was often mentioned by my grandparents some 40 years after it happened. As was the plot to murder Jacques Yablonsky, which was planned in LaFollette but carried out hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania. Yet no one ever mentioned the killing of 4 people, including 3 children, and a wild court case complete with a surprise witness. It's odd how that could have been lost in the pages of history when it is likely the most heinous crime committed in the history of Campbell County. And that is how history records it. This has been Alan Miller for the Volunteer Time series, Lawless LaFollette.